over 41 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is Build Situation Room. And we start with Ukrainian long-range attacks on strategic targets in Russia. These were significantly ramped up once again in recent days. We begin with an attack on a major oil refinery in Saratov, situated near the Kazakh border. First, we see Russian anti-aircraft fire at night, but then notice that there are several explosions and that this large refinery in Saratov is struck by Ukrainian long-range drones, most likely of the Lyuty model, that would at least fit in terms of range. We now see here that eyewitnesses successfully managed to capture the entire nighttime incident on video recordings clearly. We can clearly see this massive fire that broke out at night right in this refinery. And we see that the Ukrainians have indeed intensified this attack in recent days and weeks after there were no such attacks on refineries for about 3 months. Probably due to Western pressure. Here we see the situation during the day, and we can again see quite clearly that there are 3 fire spots, 3 different ones that are still burning here. It's possible that there were secondary explosions caused by the hits in this network. However, it's more likely that at least 3 Ukrainian drones managed to get through and successfully struck this facility, specifically targeting the large refinery located here in the Saratov region. But Saratov was only one of the 3 attacks we are aiming to document today. This morning there was already the 4th one, we'll address that later. The next attack occurred on Yelabuga, or rather near Yelabuga, and here there are very, very clear recordings that pretty much confirm we're dealing with a Lyuty drone. Here we see it. That means one of these drones with a range extending up to roughly 1,500 kilometers. We can clearly see the tail section, the engine at the rear, and the spinning propeller. And we also know that the German federal government has been co-financing these drones for several months now, so they are helping Ukraine build many of these drones. We now see the attack here on not a factory, but a warehouse for Chinese goods that were recently brought in and stored there to then produce and assemble the Shahed 136 or Geran 2 drones, as the Russians refer to them, just a few kilometers away, approximately 50 kilometers from Yelabuga. We also see here actually a lot of employees, a lot of workers who filmed everything around the area, who just received the alarm and immediately rushed to their cars or made their way straight to the parking lot. And the entire situation was very well documented by the various Russian employees who, it must be clearly stated, are actively helping Putin to maintain the ongoing terror war against Ukraine. And we want to take a closer look at another attack, this time in the Komi region, which is extremely far away, 1,700 kilometers from Ukraine. And here we see the attack on Ukhta, and this time we see a different drone, which clearly means it's not an AN-196 Lyuty drone, but rather something that looks like a very, very large shark drone from Ukraine. We see the attack from one side in 2 different perspectives. Here we see it once again. And also a tank was hit here, specifically a fuel tank was struck. Just great luck for the Russians, there was no explosion. Here we see it, one of the tanks, that's exactly where the drone made a direct and precise hit. So you can really see it happening with precision down to just a few meters. And we can hopefully also see relatively clearly that fuel is coming out here. It's flowing. Lucky for the Russians, while there was an impact, we also saw an initial explosion here, visible from the soot traces around it. But this tank didn't catch fire. We're looking at the whole thing on the map, and we can see that indeed the range of the Ukrainians, as well as the specific region where they are actively operating, is continuously increasing, and this whole thing shows us just how utterly defenseless the Russian air defense is against these drones overall. We just saw the images from Saratov, where the refinery was targeted near Yelabuga, where the storage facility for parts and components used in the various drones was hit. And also from Komi, from Ukhta up here in the north of Russia. And with that, we see that various targets ranging from 700 kilometers to 1,000 kilometers, and finally up to 1,700 kilometers away from Ukraine, have been hit. We highlighted them here. This means Russia can no longer feel safe in the entire western part of its country. However, and it's always important to note, these are only small drones, not cruise missiles, not Tomahawks or anything similar that could also do this. This means we are dealing with relatively minor damage at each of the targeted Russian facilities. From Russia, we now go to Ukraine, where we look at the new developments on the front lines and as often start with the use of drones, specifically fiber optic drones. in this case on both sides of the front line. And we see, I wanted to show this again today, how similar the strategies have become. First, an attack here in a forest. That also was not possible at all before because of all the trees. Here now a drone, even though it has a fiber optic cable connected to it at the back, manages to successfully strike a Buchanka bus belonging to the Russian army. And we once again see the transport issues the Russians are experiencing. Because we can just count how many Russians noticed this, meaning they became aware of this attack, here running away from their vehicle before it got struck. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's still one inside and another one in the front as well. That means at least 8 Russian soldiers were in this Buchanka, and the majority of them fled the scene. However, 2 or 3 were still inside at the moment of impact. Next, we observe Russian artillery pieces that were relatively well protected, yet still ended up being detected and exposed. The first one here, this is actually the muzzle of the barrel. What you can see here from this D20 gun, 152 millimeters, which was driven into this specific position and set up for operation in the designated field area, which quite interestingly was actually ready to fire, positioned right in this hole, and was now precisely targeted and hit by a fiber optic guided drone from the Ukrainian army. Next, we see more artillery guns, which means this unit of Ukraine has apparently specialized in attacking artillery, and what appears to be some kind of path here in front, a sort of walkway constructed from various boxes, that is. The shielded barrel of this artillery piece is specifically designed to protect it from incoming enemy fire and damage. Now we see it again quite clearly here, so the muzzle opening is visible down here, extremely difficult for Ukraine to detect, and yet they managed to do it. And now the attack here, lastly we see another attack, in this case on a D30 artillery piece. And what you can see here relatively well, I think we need to focus on it again, is the defensive fire from the Russians. Somewhere in the forest on the right, the Russians likely heard the drone and are now firing at it. We're about to see the tracer rounds passing by here, so we see various small flashes, and now at the end, the attack on this D30 artillery piece, 122 millimeters, as it's targeted and hit directly by the strike with precision and force, which was then hit as well. And in the end, similar to what we'll see in the Russian videos, we observe something called a drone ambush happening right there on the spot, which means since we're dealing with fiber-guided drones, they can be deployed directly on the ground or positioned at the horizon, lying in wait quietly and discreetly until they are activated at exactly the right strategic moment for maximum impact. Only the camera is active exactly when the enemy passes by. We're about to see a Russian, well, what is that? A tractor, something like that, passing by here. So it is parts of the Russian logistics are now organized like this, and we're seeing the drone take off, start the attack, and interestingly, both Russians on this vehicle are not wearing any helmets whatsoever, leaving them completely vulnerable and highly exposed, particularly to the direct impact caused by this Ukrainian drone attack. But the whole thing, as I said, is something we see on both sides. We want to take a closer look at the Russian strategy now, and it is absolutely similar. So here we also see the drone waiting on the ground, lurking, and on the very left side, let me just move over, on the far left side, we now spot a Ukrainian off-road vehicle approaching. That's driving up here. The Russians zoom in on it, and we're not entirely sure why they did that. Probably there's something lying on the road here, maybe a decoy or another drone. The Ukrainians stopped at exactly the right moment, and the Russians' trap snapped shut in that instant, because the drone took off right at that precise moment and flew directly into this Ukrainian off-road vehicle that had just been actively in use here only moments ago. We see that civilian vehicles are also repeatedly being targeted, which doesn't necessarily mean they are civilians, but rather that the Ukrainians are facing significant logistical challenges and therefore have to rely more and more on civilian vehicles to transport their soldiers to the front. Now here's the next ambush, which was essentially lying in wait right there on the ground, positioned along the road. Probably the surveillance drones had informed them the Ukrainians are here now, and now we see the attack on this Toyota, which just at the very last moment, the Ukrainians jump out, but the vehicle is then probably destroyed accordingly. And so it's relatively interesting. We see both sides are once again have learned from each other, are using the same weapons, the same tactics, and are trying to outmaneuver the opponent with what they partially learned from him and partially introduced as their own innovation to weaken him here. Let's take a look at another Ukrainian fiber optic attack, this time once again on a bridge. And it's quite interesting. Apparently the Russians didn't just have this as an isolated case like what we recently saw in Bryansk, where bridges in their own occupied territory or within Russia itself were rigged with explosives. But it actually seems to be part of a broader agenda. And here we see another attack, once again by a Ukrainian fiberglass drone. Otherwise it wouldn't be able to operate below the horizon line, meaning it operated under the bridge in this small river valley here. And this drone, as mentioned, captured a similar video to the one from last time, and it spotted that indeed a number of nets were hung down here to ensure it remained entirely concealed from view and unnoticed. However, inside there are mines, specifically TM62 plate mines attached to various structures and points spread throughout the entire area to the various fixtures of this bridge. And one of them was struck directly by the drone And we're about to see from a different perspective this truly massive explosion. This whole thing is a bridge in the occupied territory of the Donetsk region. And we see the explosion here, and then immediately from another drone we can observe how the entire bridge was brought to collapse. Not because the Ukrainians used so much explosive power here, but because the Ukrainians had observed that the Russians, in case of a Ukrainian advance in this area, had already prepared this. They mined the bridge, and the whole situation ended up backfiring on them instead. But of course, not only drones, but also heavy weapons, especially glide bombs, guided bombs of the Russian army, play an important role in this war. What we can see in the following footage from Siversk, a city we've covered more frequently in recent days because the Russian pressure has increased here, still located before Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. This is the current situation in Siversk, a city that was once home to over 15,000 people. These residential buildings clearly show that no one can live there anymore. Life there is impossible now. Only a few hundred Ukrainian civilians still remain, probably along with a few thousand Ukrainian soldiers who are currently defending the area. And here we see footage from the past few days. 2 men, likely soldiers, though it's not confirmed, are seen walking through the streets of Siversk recently. And we can observe the situation across all these areas here in this region. And of course, we see that all of this happened due to massive Russian attacks with large calibers, either with missiles. We also see here these enormous massive craters, for instance, either caused by rockets, glide bombs, or artillery. In any case, this has led to the fact that here in Siversk, no civilians, or almost no civilians, are left waiting for the Russian army, but that at that moment, when the Russians might possibly capture Siversk in the coming months, they are currently slowly approaching, but have not yet reached the city, that essentially no one here is waiting for Putin or his forces, who would then celebrate the so-called liberation, as Russian propaganda always claims. Let's also take a look at this on the map to see once again if it would indeed be a key location alongside Pokrovsk. First, we zoom in and see that it would be up there to the right in the east. And here is Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Now we move further in and we see that the Russians managed to get closer in recent weeks. Earlier, the distance was approximately 7 kilometers. At present, it has narrowed down to just about 2 kilometers between the Russian forward units, which, however, had attempted to advance forward there using mechanized assaults. We saw that in videos. They were completely destroyed, but the Russian soldiers partly took over the former Ukrainian positions there and are now entrenched, waiting for reinforcements, so that Siversk can also be stormed. We see this is the current situation in the city, around the city. And even though not a single Russian has entered the whole thing, as I said, and just saw the city completely emptied, a ghost town, another one that Russia then wants to conquer in the coming weeks and months. We just mentioned it, part of this devastation comes from multiple rocket launches from Russian missiles. And to bring an end to this terror, here we are showing another video from the 93rd Brigade, part of the Ukrainian army. In this case, we clearly see it's not a fiber optic drone, but rather a radio-controlled drone. From the footage, we can see that it's being used, but those are still very potent, still fully capable. Down there, we can clearly observe it, not just detecting, but also actively engaging a Russian BM-21 multiple rocket launcher. The whole thing, once again, we see the Russians increasingly relying on light units. Here we have the explosions now, first the impact, and then immediately the detonation of the entire payload of 40 rockets. The Russians who are increasingly relying on light units, ATVs and so on, motorcycles and so on, they still have, of course, this massive firepower in the background, for example, in the form of this BM-21, which, however, was destroyed in this case now. Ultimately, we intended to head towards Pokrovsk, where the Russians successfully managed to achieve another breakthrough. There are no current images here yet. However, the entire thing has been confirmed by Deep State Map, our map provider, and other bloggers who have analyzed it. And we see once again this huge problem in the Ukrainian defense. The frontline sectors are partly thinly manned, and we have significant gaps in the front that stretch several kilometers wide in certain critical areas. And one of these gaps was exploited in recent days, that is over the weekend. We can see that this entire area here was not yet under Russian control. They advanced a total of 13 kilometers to the north and successfully achieved their goal. We don't see the northernmost tip yet, arriving here at another strategic village. And Dobropilya, where our colleague Paul Ronsheimer was stationed recently or just yesterday, reporting from that specific location, is now only about 10 kilometers away from the territory currently controlled by Russian military forces. That means this crucial supply point. I was also there in April of this year. This vital supply hub for Pokrovsk is now well within reach for everyone involved. The small kamikazes are under threat as the Russians manage to push forward once more. And this advance is not just a breakthrough of the Ukrainian front, but it particularly puts the Russians in a tactical position to bring their highly experienced drone teams even further into the interior, allowing them to threaten the entire logistics network from there. Around Pokrovsk, the situation has barely changed. We had some individual, allegedly up to 150 Russian soldiers made it into Pokrovsk in small units, but they were likely pushed back by the Ukrainian army. That means we currently have this encirclement around Pokrovsk itself, the former city of 65,000 inhabitants. However, it seems that the Ukrainian units, which have now arrived to reinforce the area, were pulled out from other nearby operational zones. Which is why we now have the difficult situation where the logistical supply for the city, plus Myrnograd right next to it, is becoming harder and harder for the Ukrainians.